Okay. Good to see you again today. Shh. If anyone needs a copy of the syllabus or a class entry code application, there's some up here you can pick up after class today. Okay, today we're going to talk about demand and supply, the first lecture on demand and supply. Demand and supply is a concept that is pervasive within our psyches. Everyone in our society has a concept of demand and supply. And this is actually one of the most important things that economics as a profession has contributed to the world. It's an astonishing theory of how prices and output levels are determined within free markets. In fact, it's so pervasive in our psyche, people say all the time, oh, it's just a matter of supply and demand. We forget that it actually, somebody had to come up with this at one point and think of things in this particular way. It's a great example of how theory, that is, stripping away things that are irrelevant, focusing on things that are the forces that we're interested in, can truly affect and influence the way you think about stuff. Okay? So it is pervasive in our society, this concept, and yet it is exceedingly poorly understood. This theory is much more subtle and much more powerful than anyone normally gives it credit for. It's just amazing the kinds of things that you can do with just concepts of demand and supply, implications that they have that you wouldn't be able to work out without these concepts. So what I want to do today is give you an example of that. Start from the beginning. What is demand? What is supply? How do they work together? And then an example of how you can get some implications that you might not have thought were something that could come from such a simple theory. And today we're going to use a continuing example of salmon. That's the little fish I drew up here. You might think that's a silly example, but it's not. Salmon's a huge industry, especially in the West Coast. There's a lot of money associated with it. Also, it's a very big issue for environmental issues. I think this last year, 2011, was the first year in about 8 in which we've had actual free fisheries for salmon off the California coast. Prior to that, for various reasons, parts of the fisheries have been closed off for part of the season or all of the season because of reduced salmon populations. And every year we have to go through this thing of examining whether we can continue fishing for salmon. Also, I don't know, how many of you know about the Columbia Snake River? Has all these dams, and they actually have built little ladders for the salmon to go up to pass the dams. I mean, this is a tremendous amount of money we're spending just to make sure salmon can continue to be alive. And those dams actually don't work as well as a free-flowing river, and so there's constantly proposals being put forth by the government and local people to remove some of the dams along the Columbia Snake. It might actually happen. Okay, so that, shows that this is an important topic. But we're going to start from the beginning. Demand and supply essentially creates two groups of people that the more you can think of them as being separate, the better your thought process is going to be. There's the people who buy goods, and there's the people who create and sell the goods. Okay? Obviously, you can be both, but it's easiest to think about it separately. So let's look at demand first, then supply, then put them together. Okay, so the idea with demand is it's a hypothetical construct. This is important to recognize. This is a theory, and it explains things by asking hypothetical questions, getting answers to them, and describing what the implications of that are. The first thing you ask for the demand is, if the price were a certain level, it's not necessarily at that level, but if price were at a certain level, what is the quantity that people, consumers, would buy of the good, would be willing and able to buy of the good? And where's my little pointer? I think that's it. There. So what I've done here is ask that hypothetical question for three different prices. If price is $8, we don't know what the price is yet. This theory is going to explain what the price will end up being. But if the price were $8 per pound, then 12,000 pounds would be purchased by people at that price. Okay? If the price were $6, you'd sell more because it's cheaper now. People would buy more salmon and less other fish. They might switch over, instead of buying chicken, buy salmon for dinner. And so there's going to be an increase in the amount that people are willing to buy at that price. And at a price of $4, people buy even more. Okay? So what we can do is just graph those points. And they're graphed in a particular way. We'll find later in the class that this is actually the opposite way of what would make sense mathematically, but it makes sense intuitively, so we're going to do it this way. Put price on the vertical axis, so it's price per pound. You put quantity on the horizontal axis, which is the quantity. And then you say, ask your question, at any given price, what is the quantity that's going to be purchased at that price, that people would be willing and able to purchase of that good at the price? So the first point we saw was a price of $8. The quantity is 12, and this quantity is measured in thousands, so we don't have to put all the trailing zeros. That's one point. The next point is at $6, you would have 18, and $4 for 24. We could have asked this question, and the theory behind this is that we essentially would implicitly ask this question for every single possible price. And so we would get these 3 points, but all the points in between them. Let's draw a line that connects all those points, and that now includes all the points, including these 3, but everything in between them and extending beyond them. Okay? So it just tells you at every given price, what is the quantity that would be purchased at that price. This is called the demand curve. I've drawn it as a line just because it's easier to draw it as a line. Generally, you wouldn't think that a demand curve is a straight line. It could curve. That's why it's called a demand curve. And we're going to talk later in this class about why it would be curved and what the implications of that are. Okay? But it's easiest to just draw it as straight. It gives the quantity that consumers buy at each price. And so you start on the left-hand side at price, read over to the quantity, and it gives you the quantity that people would buy at that price. Now, as I've drawn it, it's downward sloping. If you look at it and you try to put a ball up here, it would just roll right down. Okay? That's what's meant by downward sloping. The other way to think about it that is more important or more fundamental is that if you change the price of the good, the quantity that is demanded would go in the opposite direction. So if you lowered the price, okay, what happens to quantity is that the quantity actually increases. The quantity that people are willing to buy increases. This is what you would expect, that you would expect that as the good gets cheaper, more people are willing to buy it than otherwise. Okay. It also, though, works in the reverse. This is why I think this downward sloping demand name is a little bit problematic. When you're going this direction, it looks like you're going down. But the same thing occurs when you're going in the other direction. If you raise the price from a particular level and said what would happen if we raised the price to a higher price, the quantity demanded decreases, and now it looks like we're going up the hill. Right? So what does it mean, downward sloping? What it actually means is the quantity changes in the opposite direction of the price. Now, we define this as a law of downward sloping demand. What that means is that in nearly all instances, you expect demands for goods to be downward sloping. In rare, exceedingly rare instances, it's possible that an increase in the price of the good could actually increase the demand for it. But it's exceedingly rare. Usually, that's not the case. Notice that this is the demand for a given good. That means holding all characteristics of the good constant. So usually if you think the demand curve is upward sloping, it's because you're actually not holding all the characteristics of the good constant other than just price. Okay. So let's think of some things. What are some ideas of where, can you think of any cases in which an increase in the price of the good actually causes more people to want to buy it? Yeah. Yes, and in fact, what you said, okay, I'll repeat because you can't hear everything. The example was universities. If you increase the price, then it increases the prestige of the university, and more people want to go there. Okay, that is true. That as you increase the price, the demand will rise, or perhaps true. But notice what the reason was. It's because a characteristic of the university has now changed. It's now more prestigious. So nearly always when you think that the demand curve is upward sloping in this particular fashion, it's because implicit in the explanation is something else is changing about the good. In this case, the good is not the same. It's more prestigious. So that's one example. What's another one? A very popular one, yeah. Right. So they're a car that's more prestigious. If you raise the price of it, it becomes even more prestigious, and the demand could increase. That's true for some cars. I don't know who would buy a Bentley for $300,000 if it weren't for the self-image that comes from it. But again, what's happening there is, as you raise the price, it becomes more prestigious. If a Bentley costs $25,000, no one would buy it because it's like too huge to park. It's raising the price, giving it that prestige. So what's happening there again is you're changing the quality of the good. You're changing the good. This is important. One other example that's really popular, yeah. Stocks. It is quite often the case the price of stocks go up. This is what created the huge boom up till 2008. The price of stocks go up. Everyone thinks that means they're going to continue going up, and so they want to buy even more stocks. Everyone gets onto the bandwagon. But again, what has happened there is our concept of where the stock price is going to be in the future has changed. The price going up now makes us think it's going to go up in the future. If it didn't go up now, we wouldn't think it's going up in the future. So again, that's a characteristic of the good, our perception of its future value that is changing. If you take away all those instances, there are practically none. You will learn in 100A, when you take that class, of one particular kind of good for which there's actually an upward sloping demand curve, but it's exceedingly rare. And it's important to think through these things. I like these examples because it helps you to understand what exactly we're talking about with demand. You really need to think through these examples. So I'm glad for all these suggestions here. Okay, now, what I've talked about so far is the demand curve given for one particular good with characteristics of that good and just changing the price of the good. So that's the only thing that's changing. What if something else in the economy changes other than the price? There's all kinds of things that affect what people buy. There's all kinds of things that affect why we choose one good over another good. If any of those things change, then that's going to affect the demand curve. For example, if we all have higher income, somehow we get more income, then the demand for salmon, which is more expensive to eat than most foods, probably rises. What that would mean is at any given price, what used to be the quantity demanded is now going to be higher because more people are going to be buying it at that price. So a change in the price of the good is represented, as I've described, by the demand curve itself, okay? But a change in anything else in the economy that affects how people decide what to buy is represented by a shift of the entire curve, okay? So here's an example of where it shifts out. Anything that affects what people choose to buy is going to affect the demand curve. So the demand curve is best thought of as existing at a point in time and then can be changing over time. If a report comes out showing that salmon has higher levels of mercury than we had previously thought, then people will quit buying it so much and the demand curve will shift in. What's another example of something that would cause the demand curve to shift one way or the other? Yeah. Yes. If the price of, say, maybe that's, yes. Here, if the price of halibut goes down, then you might buy halibut at the store instead of salmon, and so the demand for salmon comes in. So it's mainly income, prices of alternative goods, that's what we've shown here, and our sense of the quality of the good itself, which in this case, the example I was giving was our sense of the health benefits from it. Okay? So any of those things changing can change the demand curve. Okay, so just to be very clear, we use, there's a crucial difference in the use of a preposition when we talk about movements of demand, changes of demand. When we talk about the change in the quantity demanded from, suppose we start at a price of $6 and there's 18,000 pounds that are being demanded. If we're talking about a change in the quantity demanded as a result of the price changing, that's movement along the demand curve. The preposition there is along the demand curve. If you're talking about a change due to something else other than the price, it's a movement of the demand curve. So you have two types of movements, a movement along the demand curve or movement of the demand curve. And it's, even though it's just a preposition and it sounds a very small difference, it's a crucial difference in how the analysis will play out and whether you'll get insightful results or nonsense from your analysis using demand and supply curves. So keep those changes in mind. Okay, so that's the demand side. Then we have the people who are supplying salmon. For wild salmon, these are people that go out on boats and usually trawling boats and harvest the salmon from the seas. And they decide whether to go out, whether it's worthwhile, and their decision is based on what they think they're going to be able to sell the product for. Okay? So if the price is relatively high at $8 a pound, then you'll get lots of people going out and deciding to spend the time necessary to catch salmon and bring it into port and sell it. If the price dropped to $6, then those people would be less willing. Some of them would decide, well, it's better to do something else with my time, fish for some other fish, or not go out at all and work at some other job. And the result would be that there's fewer amount of this salmon provided by the people who are supplying it. And similarly with four. So you do the same thing here. You graph them, price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. Okay. When the price is $4, you get that, 8, all three, just like on the demand side, it's just a flip of the whole thing. And the curve that connects all those is called the supply curve. It's the, gives the quantity that firms provide at each price. Now, we do not have anything equivalent to the law of downward sloping demand that applies to the supply curve. It is quite possible that the supply curve is flat. And in fact, as we will see later in this course, the crucial benefits of competition come from the fact that in a competitive market, the market supply curve ends up being flat. It has no upward slope. So here we don't have that, the same type of analysis. Essentially what's happening there with a flat supply curve is if the price is below some point, nobody will supply it because it's, you can't make money at it. And if price is above that amount, everyone in the world would want to supply it because everyone can make a profit at it. Okay? So you get an all or nothing kind of scenario, and the flat line is just, you know, what connects those two zeros and very large number. Okay? That's quite possible. Okay? Okay, so we also, though, have to think about why the supply curve changes. First of all, there's movement along the supply curve. As the price changes, the quantity supplied would change. But there's also shifts in the supply curve itself due to anything that would affect the people who are providing this. Yeah? If the price dropped to aha, perfect. What you're bringing in now is the interaction of demand and supply. If suppliers don't provide enough of the salmon for what people want, the price is going to be driven up. But what you're implicitly doing in your statement is saying the amount that ends up being supplied is going to depend not just on suppliers' decisions, but on the interaction of that with demand. And that's very important. We're going to get to that after this. We're going to put supply and demand together. That's the key element, what you're talking about. But before you get to that, it's very important to talk about suppliers and demanders and get that in your head separately. The suppliers in this case, our hypothetical question was, if the price is $8, how much would suppliers be willing to supply? Okay? They can't do anything about the price. We're not saying, well, if they could negotiate the price or they knew the price was going to change. It's if it's $8, what would they do? If it were $6, what would they do? And they were guaranteed that price. Okay? We're going to find out later that hypothetical does not actually occur in the world, but our thinking in terms of the hypothetical helps us to understand what goes on in the world. Yeah? Let me get into the demand and supply interaction and then show how that's probably, we actually have, next lecture, we're going to have a whole thing on oil prices. So let's defer that, okay? But what these have pointed out is that the demand curve and the supply curve are asking hypotheticals that need not end up activated in the economy. It's saying, if the price is $8, what would consumers buy? If the price were $8, what would suppliers supply? And yet the price might not end up being $8, okay? But we still ask that hypothetical to define these terms. This is how this is much more subtle than people think. You know, it's a strange thing where you're using a hypothetical that is demonstratively false to show how the market works. But it actually helps you do that. Okay, so now the shifts in the supply curve, what you want to do here is the same thing as on the demand curve, but think about what affects suppliers' decisions. Things that affect their decisions on how to produce this good or how much to produce is what's going to shift the supply curve. So again, you want to switch your thinking to the supply side and what affects them. Well, suppliers, the main thing that affects them is the cost of going out and doing their business. And if they can't get a high enough price to cover their costs, they're going to not do it. So for example, if the cost of motor fuel to power these boats goes down, there's going to be more people willing to go out because they're going to make more profit at any given price. So at any given price, whatever profits people were making before, now with a lower price of oil, they're going to make more profits and more people are going to be wanting to go out getting those profits. So there's going to be an increase in the supply of the salmon when the cost of producing it, of supplying it in this case, goes down. And if bad weather occurs, something that's not technological or economically related, but just does affect people's decisions, that would cause an inward shift. People don't want to go out when it's dangerous to be out on the seas. And so there's going to be an inward shift in the supply curve. Okay, so now we interact the two. You could probably guess the point of demand and supply is to figure out what the price is going to be in the market. Not all these hypotheticals of if price were this, but what is price going to be? So we have a downward sloping demand curve, a supply curve that is often upward sloping. It can be flat for reasons we'll see later in this class. But you put those together, it doesn't take a genius to think about, well, there's going to be something happening there. Okay? But before you get to that intersection, I think it's important to look at the process that occurs that moves price in particular directions and why that intersection is important. So I want you all in this class, when you see a graph like this or anything, there's an immediate tendency to go to the solution, and you can often visually see what the solution must be, okay? But rather start somewhere else and see why it is, how you get there. So that's what I want to do now. Suppose the price is $4. Okay? What's going to happen is we're going to have 8,000 pounds of fish supplied by suppliers. That's how much they're willing to go out and catch these fish. But we're going to have 24,000 pounds that people want to buy. Okay? So what's going to happen here? The first thing that's going to happen is this is going to be the quantity that's actually sold at that price. Why is that? It takes two parties to make a transaction. You have to have a buyer and a seller. It takes two to tango. So what it means is there's only this many suppliers. Each of them will hook up with a buyer and make a transaction at that price. Okay? And all of these remaining buyers will be left without having their demand satisfied. They want to buy at that price, but they're not able to. So the quantity that's actually provided here is the lower of the two, demand and supply, because it always takes both parties to agree to the transaction. So this is the quantity that will actually be transacted at that price. And what will happen is there will be a latent demand, excess demand for the good at that price. There's going to be this amount of the good that could have been sold at that price if anyone had actually provided it, but no one did. Okay? The suppliers didn't want to provide that much. They didn't want to go out that long and go fishing. Okay? And so we have a shortage of the good, people wanting to buy the good more than are able to buy the good. And what happens with a shortage? In every market that you can think of, somehow a shortage translates into increased prices. We can try the hardest way we can to avoid that. There's price controls, but inevitably it somehow happens. There's price control on rent control in Manhattan on apartments. Well, what happens? You get these side deals between the manager and, there's some way in which it happens. What happens is, you can think about this kind of in a weird process. If the boats come in to, say, Fisherman's Wharf, and they say, we got lots of people wanting to buy our goods, each person who's selling salmon could say, well, if you buy it from me for $4.50, I'll sell it to you, and at least you'll get it rather than not having it at all. Okay? And so the suppliers will raise their price, knowing that they'll still be able to sell it at a high price at $4. So even though the price now currently is $4, there will be a tendency for the suppliers to try to raise their price and convince buyers to buy it from them rather than do without, which they'll find some that do that. Or if you're out there at Fisherman's Wharf and want to get salmon because you're planning to have a dinner party that night, and you want to be sure to be one of the people to get it, the natural thing to do would be to walk up to a supplier and say, I'll pay you $5 for it. Sell it to me instead of that person. Okay? Both sides of the interaction would put pressure to have prices rise. Yeah? This doesn't shift the supply curve. What's happened here is at this price, this is how much people who are selling salmon are willing to go out and catch it and bring it back in for. This is how much people want to buy. And what happens is we have more people wanting to buy than there are being sold, and at the existing price, that means the price won't stay that way. Price will rise. Both parties will place some kind of pressure on price to rise. Either the suppliers will say, if you want to buy it, you got to pay $4.50 from me, and people will buy it from them. When that happens now, what's getting at your question now, is when that happens, what's interesting is, as the price rises, now the price is higher, and more people are going to be willing to supply the good. So that's how the shortage goes away. As the price starts out at $4, and there's pressure on price to rise, as the price rises, both parties bidding it up, the suppliers then start being willing to supply more of the good, and the shortage gets smaller. And what else happens when the price rises? As the price rises, fewer people want to buy it. They might be willing to buy that much at $4, but at $4.50, some of them don't want to buy anymore. And so both sides of this change over time to reduce the shortage until eventually the shortage is gone. So it's not a shift in the demand curve or the supply curve that causes this. Both of them are where they are, and all that's happening is now a price that started out at a particular level, because it causes a shortage, it cannot continue that way. It won't continue that way. And what we have is a change in price, which is a movement along the supply curve and a movement along the demand curve, both of which serve to reduce the shortage. And so what happens is, if you're ever in a situation where there is more demand than supply, there's a tendency for prices to rise. So you can't stay there. It won't just continue to be there. Suppose you would look at the other side, you get the same story, but just in reverse. At a price of $8, suppliers now really like that. They're willing to go out and spend a lot of time out catching fish and bringing them back. $28,000. But buyers only want to buy 12,000 of them, and what we have is a surplus. Okay, again, what is the quantity that's actually going to be transacted at this price? It's going to be the lower, because it takes two to tango, which is interesting. What this tells us is this curve is an answer to a set of hypothetical questions. What if price were a certain level? Okay, this curve is also an answer to hypothetical questions. And the only parts that we would ever potentially observe are actually the left-hand side here. This part, not only is it hypothetical, but it's never seen. You don't transact out there. That doesn't mean those parts of the curves are not important, because they determine what would happen if things changed, okay? But it just points out again that this is a theory that is a great example of how thinking about things in a particular way can truly help you analyze problems, okay? And all of this is hypothetical and never observed. So it's not, the idea that a theory has to only be about facts is not true. It's not true. That what? Never intersect. Yes. And in fact, your section's going to go over some. And you might want to think about some, why that might happen. They could not intersect. And those goods we just don't see in the market. Okay, so what happens when there's a surplus? Suppliers have all this fish. They brought it into Fisherman's Wharf. They can't sell it. What do? They start saying, hey, buy from me. I'll sell it to you for $7 instead of $8. Buy from me, I'll sell it to you for $6. And the people who are going there see that there's all this fish piled up, nobody buying it, and say, well, if you want me to buy this, I'll pay you $6 for it, not $8. There is going to be some mechanism somewhere in the system that causes the price to drop. And that's what's going to happen. Okay? And in both of those, on both sides, again, as the price drops, the quantity that people buy is going to go up. That reduces the surplus, and the quantity that people supply is going to go down. That reduces the surplus also, and you move. So if you're above that intersection, the tendency is for price to go down. If you're below the intersection, the tendency is for price to go up. If you're at this intersection, you have neither a surplus or a shortage, and that's equilibrium. Okay? At $6, the quantity that's supplied is exactly equal to the quantity that's demanded. Okay, so in an equilibrium, the equilibrium price is where there's no shortage or surplus. Okay? This, however, is a definition. It's not a definition. This is a characteristic of equilibrium in this situation. Okay? The definition of equilibrium, we're going to use equilibrium throughout this whole course. It's a central concept of economics, is that there's no tendency for change. Okay? Notice that at any other price that we were at, there was some force operating to not allow us to stay there. If we're at a lower price, such that there was a shortage of the good, there's going to be a tendency for prices to rise, and we won't stay there. If we get a higher price, there's a tendency for price to drop. Only at this price is there no tendency for it to change, and so we would stay there once we're there. Okay, that's what equilibrium is defined as, is no tendency for change. It's kind of like, what is the Buddhist concept? Samadhi, balance. You have nice balance. That's what's this. In a demand and supply situation, as we've described, this means that there's no shortage or surplus. The demand is equal to supply. However, you probably already know, just from your lay concepts of economics, or if you took this in high school, there can be equilibrium in some types of situations that have shortages or surpluses. Can anyone think of an example of an equilibrium where you have no tendency for change, and yet there's a surplus? I guess so. You have a surplus. That's a hard thing to think about. A rational supplier wouldn't have a surplus. They'd only produce exactly what they need to sell. The capability of having a surplus makes them able to maintain, whatever. Externalities was the question, was the answer. Maybe. We're going to get into that. Let me just tell you what I was thinking. Sorry. Remember Keynesian economics? You can have an equilibrium in the economy with unemployment. You've got an excess of workers looking for jobs and not enough jobs for them all. And you can sit there forever. That's an equilibrium. That's perhaps what we're in right now with our 9.1% inflation, unemployment. That's an example, and the whole genius of the Keynesian analysis of the macroeconomy was how you can have an equilibrium, no tendency for change, with surplus labor. Okay? And that's the major topic we're going to get to in macroeconomics. But the point here is simply you want to look at equilibrium as no tendency for change. That's the insightful way to look at it. You work through the system, see if there's no tendency for change, then that's the equilibrium. And then it might be that that means no shortages and no surplus, as we have here. Okay, so what happens now to this equilibrium as the demand curves shift in one direction or another? It's relatively straightforward. Suppose there's something going on that causes people to want to buy more salmon. What that means is, say, income rises or the price of halibut increases, so people want to buy salmon instead of halibut. The old demand curve then shifts outwards, and what happens is there's an increase in the price and an increase in the quantity. Importantly, an increase in demand raises the price of the good. What essentially happens is an increase in the demand, a shift out in the supply curve, immediately creates a shortage. So at the existing price, the immediate effect is a shortage, more people wanting to buy than currently can activate their desires, and that causes upward pressure on prices. As prices rise, the quantity supplied increases, and the quantity demanded decreases until you reach this new equilibrium at a higher price. So an increase in demand, again, going through that story is important for understanding what's happening. Instead of just saying, oh, you go from here to here, to understand what happens is immediate effect is a shortage, which causes pressure on prices to go up, which causes quantity demanded and quantity supplied to converge towards each other is what's important. An increase in the supply of the good, if motor fuel gets less expensive, then that causes the price to decrease. Okay, so an increase in each of the curves has the opposite effect on the price. And again, the impact here is the same. If the immediate effect is a surplus of the good, and then that surplus causes downward pressure on prices. As prices drop, the quantity demanded goes up, the quantity supplied goes down until you reach a new equilibrium. Okay, so this is the concepts of demand and supply. I now want to show you how you can use this in a way that can profoundly affect public policy. Our government has had a war on drugs since I was in high school. It's continuing. I think more than half of the people incarcerated in California are there on drug charges. And yet, what I would hope to convince you or explain to you is that this war on drugs could be known to be doomed to failure just using basic concepts of demand and supply. Demand and supply concepts shows that it is necessarily going to fail. It can't operate correctly. Or better yet, the more effective the war on drug is at incarcerating people and reducing the supply of drugs, the more it's going to exacerbate the problem of drugs in the economy. Okay? This is something, again, that, well, it's just using the concepts of supply and demand that provide this implication without any empirical analysis, actually, except one little thing. Okay, so let's draw the demand and supply of drugs and then see what the drug program is trying to do, okay? The demand for drugs, I've drawn it here. The one thing that is important to the analysis is that I've drawn it steeply. What that means is if you're at a particular price for drugs and you raise the price, people are going to still pretty much continue buying the drugs. For addiction drugs like heroin, cocaine, meth, the price could go high and people still are going to buy it, okay? So there's going to be a relatively small diminution in the number of people, quantity demanded, as the price rises. So the demand curve, I think we can all agree, is relatively steep. There's been a lot of empirical work with this. Same is true for cigarettes. Okay? So then let's draw in the supply curve. It really doesn't matter how we draw it in. I'm just going to put it in here. The shape of it doesn't matter that much to the analysis. The steepness of the demand curve does matter. Okay, so now what we end up with is, in the absence of a war on drugs, if we just let things be as they would in a naturally occurring market, we have a demand curve and we got a supply curve. These are people supplying the drugs. These are people buying the drugs. You get some equilibrium price, and you get a price and quantity at that equilibrium. Importantly, for the analysis I'm going to describe, this box here, this square, this rectangle, is a graphical representation of the amount of money that is transacted in the drug trade. This is the price times the quantity. Remember your basic geometry that the area of a rectangle is the height times the width? Well, the height is price and the width is quantity, and so this right here, the area of that rectangle, is the quantity of money that's spent on drugs. It's the quantity of money that the drug sellers obtain as revenue and the quantity of money that the buyers have to come up with to buy it. Okay? So now, what is the effect on the war of drugs? The purpose of the war on drugs was to attempt drugs from entering the country and to imprison drug dealers. And the point of this was to reduce the supply of drugs. The point of reducing the supply was twofold. There's always been two parts of this program. One, we think that people should not be using drugs. It's harmful to themselves. There's that aspect. But actually, the bigger aspect from a political perspective is that the tremendous amount of violence and crime that's associated with the drug trade. The drug sellers have cartels and have enormous bloody battles over who's going to control the drug trade. And the drug buyers often have to engage in crime to be able to pay for the drugs that they're getting. Okay? That's one reason the demand curve is relatively steep. If the price goes up, people that are severely addicted will do what's needed to get the money to buy the drugs. Okay? So the point of the drug program was to reduce people's individual use of the drug, but also to reduce these problems associated with the drug trade. Okay? What is that going to do? We can then say, suppose the drug program is actually successful in its reduction in supply, that it actually incarcerates people, prevents drugs from coming across the border, other things like that. What that does is decrease the supply curve. Okay? So the supply curve drops from its original level to its new level. Okay? And what is the impact of that? The impact is moving from the old equilibrium to a new equilibrium. Okay? And notice, the two things that we're wanting to accomplish, this is the new amount of money that's being spent on drugs after the war on drugs has occurred. So what's happened is the amount of drugs that are actually being sold drops exceedingly little. So we don't have much impact on the amount of people actually consuming drugs, and the amount of money that is spent on drugs, that is the source of the violence for people buying the drugs and those who are selling the drugs, has actually increased. We now have more money in the drug trade than we had to start with. It's an inevitable outcome of this situation. Yeah. Right. This is because the demand curve is exceedingly steep. If the demand curve is steep, the main impact of reducing supply is going to be increasing the price. You can think of it as the original equilibrium is here, and this amount of money is spent on drugs. What happens is you incarcerate a lot of people, stop the drug from coming into the country, the supply drops to here, and there's a shortage. What happens with a shortage? The people who have the drugs then can raise the price, make a lot of more money. The people who are wanting to buy the drugs are offering to buy it, sell it to me, I'll pay more money. That causes the price to go up. And notice what happens when the price goes up. When the price goes up, the supply increases because now it becomes more profitable. Whatever people were willing to incur as a risk of getting caught, whatever profit was necessary to incur the original risk, now the risk is higher, but if you raise the profits, the same trade-off is being made. They now become willing to incur, more people are willing to incur the risk, the increased risk, to supply the drugs. Eventually, price rises high enough to where this quantity provided is practically the same as it was before, just slightly lower. What has happened is the government has increased the cost of supplying drugs such that the prices had to rise sufficiently to warrant people still supplying the same quantity as they had before. So what's happened is we've just incurred a cost on the supply side, which is then borne by the people who buy the drugs, and increased the total amount of money being spent in the market. So the amount of violence actually goes up. Now, the only way you could get out of this, if you truly believe in the war on drugs, is to say that the demand curve is not steep. But I don't think there's anyone who believes the demand curve for drugs is not steep. That you raise the price, people will just quit doing it. Oh, I'll just quit. No empirical research has shown that. So what this shows is, we could have known this beforehand if the people in our government had just taken this class, and then we could save all this money. So what do you do instead? If you have a demand and supply system like this, and you know the supply interactions, the supply effect is going to be the wrong direction, it's going to hurt things. Your other option, you've got two levers, supply and demand. Education and rehabilitation programs to reduce the the demand curve. When you reduce the demand curve, price necessarily goes down. The opposite of what reducing the supply curve does. So you start out with this amount of money right here being spent, and if your program is effective in the sense of shifting demand curve, then you actually solve your problem. Okay? Now, just a second. There's one problem with this, of course, is what if your program's not effective at, you could be throwing money down the drain but not being able to reduce the demand curve. The difference on these two arguments is if the drug program is successful in shifting the supply curve, it necessarily makes things worse. So it's one of those things that if you succeed, you necessarily lose. The demand curve, if you're successful, at least you're going to win. So either don't do anything or do it that way. Okay. See you next Wednesday. Monday is not a lecture. It's a holiday.